On a red-eye flight crossing the Atlantic, a black man slept in seat 7A. Faded hoodie, exhausted face, a purple braided bracelet peeking beneath his sleeve, no one noticed him. Then the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, tense and urgent. "If there are any combat pilots on board, please identify yourself immediately." The cabin fell silent. No one stood. The man in 7A opened his eyes. 6 years ago, he swore never to touch a flight stick again after the night he lost his best friend. But 187 lives needed someone to stand up. And his daughter was waiting for him to come home. 3 hours into the flight, most passengers had surrendered to sleep. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the steady hum of the engines created a lullaby that wrapped around the rows of seats like a blanket. Randy Williams sat in 7A, his forehead resting against the cold window. The faded gray hoodie he wore had seen better days, just like the worn jeans and the scuffed sneakers tucked beneath the seat in front of him. He looked like any other economy passenger, unremarkable, forgettable, invisible. That was exactly how he wanted it. Before boarding, he had stood in the terminal at Heathrow, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his daughter's voice message for the third time. Zoe's voice, bright and eager. Despite the late hour she must have recorded it, filled his chest with warmth. "Daddy, don't forget to bring me something from England, okay? And you'll be home on time, right? You promised." He had smiled at that, touching the purple braided bracelet on his left wrist. Zoe had made it herself last summer, her small fingers working the threads with intense concentration. "This will protect you, Daddy," she had said. "Whenever you get scared, just look at it and remember I'm waiting for you to come home." He had promised her then. He always promised. And he always kept his word. The job in London had been simple enough routine maintenance on a private jet belonging to some tech billionaire who would never know Randy's name. That was fine. Randy preferred anonymity now. The people he worked for saw a quiet technician who showed up on time and did quality work. They never suspected that the man checking hydraulic lines and calibrating instruments had once flown $70 million fighter jets off aircraft carriers. That life belonged to someone else. Someone Randy had buried 6 years ago along with his best friend. He shifted in his seat trying to find a comfortable position when the intercom crackled to life. The voice that came through was not the smooth, rehearsed tone passengers expected from commercial pilots. This voice carried an edge, a tightness that made Randy's eyes snap open before his brain fully registered the words. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. If there are any combat pilots or military pilots on board this aircraft, please press your call button immediately." The cabin stirred. Passengers who had been sleeping lifted their heads, exchanging confused glances. The ambient murmur of the engines suddenly seemed louder in the silence that followed. In seat 3C, a silver-haired woman in a cream blazer set down her glass of wine with deliberate precision. Margaret Whitmore had spent 30 years running an insurance corporation, and she had learned to read situations the way others read spreadsheets. Something was very wrong. A few rows back, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive polo shirt let out a dismissive snort. Maddox Simmons leaned toward his seatmate, voice carrying farther than he intended. "What is this, some kind of in-flight entertainment? They're probably filming something." No one laughed. Randy sat perfectly still, his heart beginning to pound against his ribs. He knew what that announcement meant. Commercial pilots didn't ask for combat pilots unless they had exhausted every other option, unless the situation had deteriorated beyond anything their training had prepared them for. His fingers found the purple bracelet pressing against the woven threads. 30 seconds passed. No one moved. No call buttons lit up. Then the intercom crackled again, and this time it was a woman's voice, the lead flight attendant struggling to maintain professional composure. "We urgently need assistance. If anyone on board has experience flying military aircraft, please contact the flight crew immediately. This is not a drill." The word urgently hung in the recycled air like smoke. Randy's chest tightened. He looked around the cabin, watching faces cycle through confusion, concern, and the first flickers of fear. A mother, 3 rows ahead, clutched her sleeping toddler closer. An elderly couple held hands across the armrest. A young businessman stared at the seat back in front of him, jaw clenched. No one stood up. No one pressed their call button. Because there was no one else. The realization crashed over Randy like a wave of ice water. He was it. Whatever nightmare was unfolding in that cockpit, he might be the only person on this aircraft who could help. But the thought of stepping forward, of touching flight controls again, sent a different kind of terror through his veins. The memory came without warning, as it always did. The darkness of a night training mission. The weight of responsibility as flight lead. His voice crackling through the radio, issuing the command that would change everything. Then Samuel's voice sharp with panic. "Randy, I've lost control." The flash of light in his peripheral vision, the silence that followed. Samuel had been more than his wingman. He was supposed to be Zoe's godfather. They had talked about it just weeks before the accident, laughing over beers about how Samuel would spoil her rotten. And then Randy had given an order, and Samuel had followed it, and a wife became a widow, and a daughter lost the uncle she would never know. The investigation cleared Randy of wrongdoing. Mechanical failure, they concluded. Nothing he could have done. But Randy knew the truth. He had given the command. He had put Samuel in that position, and no amount of official absolution could wash that blood from his hands. He had walked away from flying that day. Resigned, his commission turned down every offer from commercial airlines and took a job where he could work on planes without ever having to be responsible for the lives inside them. Zoe was all that mattered now, keeping his promise to her, coming home safe. But if he stayed silent, if he let fear keep him in this seat, would there be a home to return to 187 people? Families, lovers, children, dreamers, all of them trusting that someone would keep them safe. All of them oblivious to the fact that their lives might depend on a man they had overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. Randy looked down at the purple bracelet again. He could almost hear Zoe's voice. "You promised Daddy." He had promised to come home. But he had also spent his entire adult life promising to protect others. That oath didn't disappear just because he had traded a flight suit for a hoodie. The fear was still there, coiled in his gut like a living thing. The guilt was still there, whispering that he had no right to take control of anything ever again. But stronger than both was the simple truth that he could not sit here and let these people die. Randy unbuckled his seatbelt. The click seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. He stood. Every pair of eyes in the surrounding rows turned toward him. He saw it immediately, the flicker of surprise, the quick assessment, the dismissal. A black man in a worn hoodie standing up in response to a call for combat pilots. The doubt was written across their faces before they even knew they were writing it. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her eyes scanning past Randy before snapping back to him with visible confusion. Randy raised his hand, keeping his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm a former FA-18 pilot with the United States Navy. I can help." The flight attendant stared at him. Behind her, he could see Margaret Whitmore turning in her seat to look, one eyebrow arched in skeptical appraisal. Maddox Simmons had stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Nobody moved. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. Then the flight attendant swallowed hard and nodded once her professional training, overriding her visible uncertainty. "Follow me." As Randy walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, he felt the weight of every stare, every unspoken question, every assumption made and discarded. He kept his eyes forward, his hand brushing the purple bracelet at his wrist. He had spent 6 years running from the sky. Tonight, the sky had found him. The cockpit door loomed at the end of the narrow corridor, a barrier between the ordinary world and whatever crisis awaited beyond. The flight attendant, her name tag read. Rachel stopped just short of it, turning to face Randy with eyes full of conflict. "Wait here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to verify this with the crew." Before Randy could respond, a voice cut through the tension behind them. "Excuse me?" Margaret Whitmore had followed them from the first-class cabin, her cream blazer perfectly pressed despite the hour. She positioned herself between Randy and the cockpit door, her gaze sweeping over him with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating risk. "I think we need to discuss this before anyone enters that cockpit." Rachel's expression shifted relief, mixing with anxiety. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. I spent 30 years running an insurance corporation." Margaret interrupted, her tone polite but immovable. "I understand liability and I understand verification. This man claims to be a combat pilot, but he has no identification, no uniform, nothing to substantiate that claim. Surely someone with actual authority should confirm his credentials before we hand him control of an aircraft carrying nearly 200 souls." Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Maddox Simmons had abandoned his seat as well, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Finally, someone with sense," he declared, pointing a thick finger at Randy. "You're telling me we're supposed to trust some random guy in a hoodie? He could be anyone, a terrorist for all we know. You can't just let him walk into the cockpit because he says he can fly." Randy felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on him. He had lived with it his entire life, the assumptions, the second glances, the unspoken calculations happening behind people's eyes. He had learned to let it roll off his back to prove himself through action rather than argument, but there was no time for that now. "Boeing 777-300ER, Randy said, his voice cutting through Maddox's bluster. "Twin GE90-115B engines, each producing over 115,000 pounds of thrust. Fly-by-wire flight control system with triple redundant hydraulics. If your captain is asking for a combat pilot, it means at least 2 of those hydraulic systems have failed, and he's anticipating the need to control this aircraft through unconventional means." He met Maddox's eyes without flinching. "Do you have a better option?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Margaret studied Randy for a long moment, something shifting behind her carefully controlled expression. Then she stepped aside. "Rachel," she said quietly, "let him through. But I want to know everything that's happening in there." Rachel hesitated for only a second before entering a code into the keypad. The cockpit door clicked open. The scene inside hit Randy like a physical blow. Captain James Henderson lay slumped in the left seat, his body secured by the harness but clearly unconscious. His face had an ashen pallor and a thin trail of saliva traced down his chin. In the right seat, a younger man gripped the control yoke with white-knuckled desperation, sweat streaming down his temples despite the cool air blowing from the vents. Warning lights painted the instrument panel in angry red. 2 screens flashed identical alerts. Hydraulic System 1, fail. A third display showed Hydraulic System 2, low pressure. The numbers dropping even as Randy watched. The young pilot's head snapped toward the opening door, and his expression cycled through hope, confusion, and suspicion in rapid succession. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "This is a restricted area." Ryan Torres Wright. Randy stepped into the cockpit, his eyes already scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. 8 months since your upgrade to first officer, 2,400 hours total flight time, mostly domestic routes. He gestured toward the failing displays. "And nothing in your training prepared you for this." Ryan's jaw tightened. "How do you know my name?" Rachel spoke from the doorway. "He says he's a military pilot. Navy." Says. Ryan shook his head sharply. "Anyone can say anything. I'm not handing over this aircraft to some stranger who wandered in from coach." Randy understood the young man's fear, understood it intimately. When everything was falling apart, the instinct was to cling to protocol, to chain of command, to anything that provided the illusion of control. But illusions wouldn't land this plane. "System 1 is completely dead," Randy said, moving closer to the center console. "System 2 is hemorrhaging pressure. You've got a leak somewhere in the primary lines." "What's the status on System 3? Ryan stared at him, the question clearly not what he had expected. For a moment, professional instinct overrode suspicion. His eyes flicked to the relevant gauge. 3 is holding, he reported automatically. But pressure is fluctuating, not stable. That's because all 3 systems share a common hydraulic reservoir junction behind the cargo bay. Randy pointed to a schematic on one of the displays. If you've got a breach in the primary distribution line, it's going to affect everything eventually. Ryan's face went pale. How do you know that? Because I spent 3 years maintaining aircraft before I learned to fly them, and another 8 years flying combat missions off carrier decks. Randy's voice carried no boast, only simple fact. Your captain asked for a combat pilot because he knew what was coming. He knew you'd need someone who's trained to fly when the manual stops having answers. The young first officer looked down at Captain Henderson's unconscious form, then back at the cascade of warning lights, then finally at Randy. Something broke behind his eyes, not defeat, but the release of a burden too heavy to carry alone. He collapsed right after making the announcement, Ryan said, his voice cracking slightly. Stroke, I think. 1 second he was talking, the next he swallowed hard. I've been trying to maintain altitude and heading, but every time I adjust the controls, the response is getting mushier, like flying through syrup. Randy nodded, already moving toward the left seat. Help me move him. Carefully. Together they lifted Captain Henderson's limp form from the pilot's seat and secured him against the cockpit wall away from the controls. Rachel immediately knelt beside him, checking his pulse and breathing. Randy slid into the captain's seat. The yoke felt familiar in his hands, despite the years, despite everything. Ryan, I need you to be my eyes. Call out altitude, airspeed, and bank angle continuously. Don't stop unless I tell you to. The first officer nodded, grabbing a tablet to cross-reference with the instruments. Altitude 37,000 feet. Airspeed 462 knots. Bank angle level. Randy keyed the radio. Gander Center. This is Atlantic Flight 227 declaring an emergency. We have an incapacitated captain, multiple hydraulic failures, and are requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable runway. The response came within seconds, the controller's voice professionally calm despite the gravity of the situation. Flight 227, Gander copies your emergency. Nearest suitable runway is Halifax Stanfield. Runway 23, approximately 240 nautical miles southwest of your current position. Turning you now to heading 210. Emergency services are being notified. Roger, Halifax 23. Beginning descent when cleared. Randy adjusted the throttles slightly, feeling the aircraft respond to the power change. For now, the controls still worked, sluggish and imprecise but functional. That would not last. In the cabin behind them, word was spreading. Maddox Simmons stood in the aisle near the cockpit door, his voice carrying over the murmur of frightened passengers. Did everyone hear that the captain is unconscious? And that man, that stranger, is now flying this plane? Are we just going to sit here and accept that? Several passengers looked up, alarm building in their expressions. A woman, clutching a rosary, began to pray softly. A young couple held hands across the armrest, their faces drawn. A man in a business suit rose from his seat. He's right. We don't know anything about that guy. What if he crashes us into the ocean? The fear was spreading like wildfire, feeding on itself. Rachel had returned to the cabin, trying to maintain order, but Maddox was drowning out her reassurances. I'm telling you, we need to get him out of that cockpit, Maddox insisted. Someone else should be flying, someone we can trust. Margaret Whitmore had been watching from her seat in first class, her expression unreadable. Now she stood straightening her blazer as if preparing for a board meeting. Mr. Simmons. Her voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. I was skeptical too. More skeptical than you because I've spent my career calculating risk. She walked down the aisle toward him, her heels clicking against the floor. But I watched that man identify this aircraft's hydraulic system configuration from memory. I watched him walk into that cockpit, and immediately understand what the instruments were telling him. And I watched our first officer, a trained professional, defer to his judgment within 30 seconds. She stopped directly in front of Maddox, close enough that he had to look down at her. "What I have not seen," she continued, "is you offer a single constructive alternative. So unless you have a pilot's license hidden in that polo shirt, I suggest you sit down, put on your seatbelt, and let the man work." Maddox's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The passengers around them watched the confrontation in stunned silence. Finally, Maddox dropped back into his seat, muttering under his breath, but offering no further resistance. Margaret looked around the cabin, meeting eyes with every passenger who would hold her gaze. "We are in a difficult situation, but panic will not help us. Trust might." She returned to her seat and fastened her seatbelt with deliberate calm. In the cockpit, Randy heard none of this. His entire focus was on the failing aircraft and the shrinking window of time they had to save it. System 2 just dropped below 1,000 psi. Ryan reported, his voice tight, and System 3 is starting to trend down, slowly but definitely trending. Randy had expected this, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through his spine. "How long since the initial failure?" "Maybe 40 minutes. 40 minutes of hydraulic fluid slowly bleeding out into the atmosphere. The airplane was dying around them, system by system, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Altitude 34,000 feet, Ryan continued. Airspeed 451 knots, bank angle 2 degrees left. Randy made a minute adjustment, correcting the drift. The yoke responded, but the delay was noticeable now, a full second between input and reaction. In combat, that delay would have been fatal, and it was only going to get worse. A memory surfaced, unbidden Samuel in the cockpit next to him, grinning as they prepared for a night training exercise. "You worry too much, Randy. We've done this 100 times. Randy pushed the memory down, but it refused to stay buried. The instruments before him blurred slightly, replaced for a heartbeat by the darkness of that night 6 years ago, the radio crackling with Samuel's final transmission. He had given the order, turn left to heading 340, a standard tactical maneuver executed thousands of times in training. But something had failed in Samuel's aircraft, a hydraulic line the investigation later revealed, and the turn had become a spiral, and the spiral had become a fireball against the Black Pacific water. Randy had watched his best friend die, had listened to the desperate final seconds on the radio, unable to do anything but scream Samuel's name into the void. And now here he was again. Different aircraft, different circumstances, but the same terrible math decisions measured in lives, mistakes paid for in blood. "System 3 is dropping faster," Ryan announced, pulling Randy back to the present. 1,200 psi and falling. The main hydraulic distribution line. It had to be. The single point of failure that connected all three systems, a design compromise that made maintenance easier, but created exactly this vulnerability. "How far to Halifax?" Randy asked. Ryan checked the navigation display. 160 miles, about 20 minutes at current speed. 20 minutes, but System 3 wouldn't last 20 minutes. Maybe 10 if they were lucky. And when it went, they would lose all conventional flight controls. No ailerons, no elevators, no rudder. The yoke would become nothing more than a useless stick, and the 240 tons of aircraft around them would become a glider with no way to steer. Unless. The thought rose from somewhere deep in Randy's memory, a desperate technique he had only ever read about. Differential thrust, using the variance in engine power between the left and right engines to create asymmetric forces that could theoretically substitute for conventional controls. It had been done before. 1989 United Flight 232. A DC-10 lost all hydraulics over Iowa. The pilots had managed to reach the runway at Sioux City using nothing but throttle inputs. 185 people survived. 111 did not. "There's a way," Randy said slowly. "But it's never been done on a 777, and even in the best-case scenario, our odds aren't good. Ryan looked at him with hollow eyes. What choice do we have? Before Randy could answer, the display in front of them flashed a new warning: Hydraulic System 3, fail. The yoke went dead in his hands. For a single terrible moment, the cockpit was completely silent. Then Ryan whispered the words that every pilot dreads. We have no flight controls. Randy stared at the instruments, watching the aircraft begin a slow, uncommanded roll to the left. Without hydraulics, the plane would gradually lose its orientation, drifting off course until the physics of uncontrolled flight took over. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the situation became unrecoverable. But the engines were still running. Both GE-90s were still producing thrust, still pushing them through the sky. And where there was thrust, there was the possibility, however slim, of control. Randy reached for the throttle quadrant. His left hand found the left engine's throttle, his right hand, the right. "What are you doing?" Ryan's voice trembled on the edge of panic. "Differential thrust," Randy said. "If I increase power on the left engine and decrease it on the right, the asymmetric thrust will yaw us right. The opposite will turn us left. For pitch, I'll need to adjust both engines simultaneously, more power to raise the nose, less to lower it. That's insane. The response time alone." "I know." Randy's hands tightened on the throttles. "But it's the only option we have left." He thought of Zoe. Her smile when he came home from trips. The way she would launch herself at him the moment he walked through the door, trusting completely that he would catch her. The purple bracelet on his wrist, woven with 7-year-old fingers and infinite love. He had promised to come home. He had always promised. But this was different. This wasn't just about keeping his own life. 187 people were sitting behind him, trusting that someone would save them. Children were back there, parents, people with their own promises to keep. If he failed, they would all die. And Zoe would grow up without a father, just like Samuel's daughter had grown up without one. The thought should have paralyzed him. Instead, it crystallized something in his chest, not courage exactly, but something harder. Determination. The same steel that had carried him through combat missions, through the worst moments of his military career. He had failed Samuel. He could not change that. The guilt would never leave him, and maybe it shouldn't. But he could choose what happened next. Randy keyed the radio. "Halifax, approach Atlantic 227. Be advised we have lost all hydraulic flight controls. Attempting to land using differential thrust only. Request emergency equipment standing by, full foam deployment on runway 23. The controller's response came after a brief hesitation, professional composure barely masking the horror underneath. "Flight 227 Halifax copies. All emergency equipment is mobilizing. You're cleared direct runway 23, no traffic between you and the field. Wind is 190 at 12 knots. Good luck." Good luck. As if luck had anything to do with what was about to happen. Randy looked at Ryan, whose face had gone the color of old paper. "I need you to call out airspeed, altitude, and descent rate. Continuously. Don't stop for anything. If you see us getting too fast or too slow, say it immediately. We won't have time for second guesses." Ryan swallowed hard, then nodded. His voice, when it came, was steadier than Randy expected. "Airspeed 428 knots. Altitude 22,000 feet. Descent rate 1,800 feet per minute." "Too fast on the descent," Randy muttered, nudging both throttles forward slightly. The engines responded with a muted roar, and the aircraft's nose began to rise almost imperceptibly. "Call it out." "Descent rate reducing, 1,500, 1,200, leveling at 1,100. The coastline of Nova Scotia was visible now, a dark mass against the slightly lighter black of the ocean. Somewhere ahead, Halifax waited runway lights, foam trucks, ambulances, everything humanity could muster against the physics of disaster. 15 minutes. That was all they needed. 15 minutes of wrestling a crippled aircraft through the sky with nothing but engine power and prayer. Randy took a breath, feeling the purple bracelet pressing against his skin beneath the sleeve of his hoodie. "Okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ryan. "Let's bring these people home." The next 12 minutes were the longest of Randy's life. Flying by differential thrust was nothing like normal piloting. Every input was delayed, imprecise, requiring constant correction. To turn right, he pushed the left throttle forward while pulling the right one back, then waited an agonizing 2 seconds for the aircraft to respond. To descend, he reduced power on both engines and watched the nose drop in slow motion, fighting the urge to grab the useless yoke. Airspeed 312 knots, Ryan called out, his voice hoarse but steady. Altitude 8,000 feet, descent rate 900 feet per minute. We're drifting left, Randy muttered, nudging the throttles to compensate. The aircraft slowly, reluctantly began to correct its course. The radio crackled. Flight 227 Halifax approach. You are 5 degrees east of the runway center line. Recommend correction. 5 degrees. In a normal aircraft, that was a minor adjustment. Here it meant wrestling with engine power for 30 seconds to achieve what a flick of the wrist would normally accomplish. Randy made the correction, feeling sweat trickle down his spine beneath the faded hoodie. His fingers ached from gripping the throttles. Every muscle in his body was taut with concentration. In the cabin behind them, the fasten seatbelt signs glowed bright. Rachel and the other flight attendants moved through the aisles, their voices calm but urgent as they guided passengers into brace positions. Heads down, arms crossed over your knees. Remove glasses and any sharp objects from your pockets. Margaret Whitmore sat in 3C, her hands gripping the armrests, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. For the first time in decades, she felt completely out of control, and strangely, that brought a kind of peace. There was nothing she could do now except trust the man in the cockpit. 3 rows behind her, Maddox Simmons sat rigid in his seat, face-pale lips pressed into a thin line. He had not spoken a word since Margaret's confrontation. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his seatbelt. A mother near the back of the aircraft held her sleeping toddler against her chest, whispering prayers into the child's hair. An elderly couple clasped hands across the armrest, eyes, closed lips moving in silent conversation with God or each other or both. Altitude 3,000 feet, Ryan announced. Airspeed 240 knots. Runway in sight. Randy could see it now through the cockpit window, a ribbon of lights cutting through the darkness of the Nova Scotia coastline. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the taxiways, their emergency lights, creating a constellation of red and blue. Foam glistened on the runway surface, catching the glow of the approach lights. 2,000 feet. Airspeed 220 knots. Too fast. They were coming in too fast. Randy pulled both throttles back slightly, feeling the nose dip as the engines lost power. The descent rate increased. Descent rate climbing, Ryan warned. 1,400 feet per minute, 1,500. Randy pushed the throttles forward again, splitting the difference, trying to find the impossible balance between too fast and too steep. In a normal landing, the autopilot would handle these micro-adjustments automatically. Here, every change rippled through the aircraft like waves in a pond, requiring constant compensation. 1,000 feet. Airspeed 192 knots. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, the threshold markings becoming visible. Randy could see the EMAS, the engineered materials arresting system at the far end, a bed of specialized cellular material designed to stop aircraft that overran the runway. They would need it. Without hydraulic brakes, there was no other way to stop. 500 feet. 5. Airspeed 181 knots. Still too fast. Randy knew, but reducing speed further would risk dropping out of the sky before they reached the runway. It was a razor's edge, and he was walking it blind. "Gear!" he said sharply. "Deploy the landing gear!" Ryan's hands flew to the gear lever. The electrical system still functioned that much, at least had survived the hydraulic failure. A mechanical thunk vibrated through the airframe as the wheels dropped into position. "Gear down and locked!" Ryan confirmed, his voice cracking with desperate hope. 200 feet. The runway lights were rushing toward them now, the ground rising to meet the wounded aircraft. Randy could see individual markings on the pavement, could make out the faces of firefighters standing beside their trucks. 100 feet. The aircraft was drifting right, pushed by the crosswind. Randy tried to correct with the throttles, but there was no time. The adjustment would take seconds they did not have. 50 feet, 30 feet. "Brace!" Randy shouted. The main gear hit the runway with a violent impact that threw both pilots against their harnesses. The aircraft bounced, became airborne for a heart-stopping moment, then slammed down again with even greater force. Metal screamed against concrete as the wheels found purchase on the foam-covered surface. But they were not stopping. Without hydraulic brakes, the aircraft continued to hurtle down the runway at over 140 knots the end of the pavement, rushing toward them with terrifying speed. Randy grabbed the thrust reversers, the only braking system still available, and yanked them to maximum deployment. The engines roared as their thrust redirected forward, fighting against the aircraft's momentum. The deceleration pressed both men hard into their seats. It was not enough. The runway end lights flashed past. The aircraft plunged into the EMAS, and the world became chaos. The specialized material tore at the landing gear with a sound like continuous thunder. The cabin shook so violently that overhead bins burst open, sending bags tumbling into the aisles. Passengers screamed their voices, lost in the cacophony of grinding metal and shattering material. And then, impossibly, the aircraft began to slow. The nose dipped as the front gear dug into the arresting bed. The thunder faded to a growl, then to a groan, then to silence. The Boeing 777 came to rest at a 15-degree angle, its landing gear buried in the EMAS, its fuselage intact. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Ryan Torres let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, his hands releasing the armrests he had been gripping with white-knuckled terror. "You did it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Oh God, you actually did it." Randy sat motionless in the captain's seat, his hands still resting on the thrust reversers. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples, his throat, his fingertips. The purple bracelet pressed against his wrist, a small warmth in the aftermath of catastrophe. In the cabin, the silence stretched for one heartbeat, 2, 3. Then it shattered. Cries of relief erupted from every row. Strangers embraced each other, sobbing into shoulders they had never touched before. A child's wail rose above the chaos, followed by a mother's soothing voice thick with tears. Someone was laughing hysterically. Someone else was reciting a prayer of thanksgiving in rapid Spanish. Margaret Whitmore opened her eyes and looked toward the cockpit door, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "He did it," she breathed to no one in particular. "He actually did it." Maddox Simmons sat frozen in his seat, staring straight ahead, his face the color of ash. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply sat there, confronting something inside himself that no one else could see. Emergency slides deployed. Flight attendants began evacuation procedures, their training overriding their own shock and relief. Firefighters swarmed the aircraft foam trucks, standing ready in case of fire. Paramedics rushed aboard, heading straight for the cockpit, where Captain Henderson still lay unconscious. Within minutes, they had him on a stretcher, moving him toward a waiting ambulance that would race him to Halifax General Hospital. Randy finally released his grip on the thrust reversers. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He stepped out of the cockpit into the cabin, still wearing the faded gray hoodie, still wearing the scuffed sneakers. Nothing about his appearance had changed, but the eyes that met his were different now. Margaret Whitmore stood in the aisle as he passed, and for a moment their gazes locked. She did not smile, did not speak. She simply nodded, once a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words could hold. Maddox Simmons looked away as Randy walked by, unable to meet his eyes. Outside, the cold Nova Scotia air hit Randy's face as he descended the emergency slide. Camera flashes erupted from beyond the security perimeter, news crews already gathering, hungry for the story. But Randy barely registered them. He walked away from the aircraft, away from the emergency vehicles, until he found a quiet spot near a maintenance hangar. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed home. It rang twice before a small, sleepy voice answered. "Daddy!" Randy's throat tightened so hard he could barely speak. "Hey, baby girl, it's me." "It's really late," Zoe mumbled, still half asleep. "Are you coming home?" He looked at the purple bracelet on his wrist, its threads slightly frayed, now worn soft by years of constant presence. He thought about Samuel, about the guilt he had carried for 6 years, about the second chance he had never expected to receive. "I'm going to be a little late," he said, his voice thick, "but I'm coming home. I promise." He could almost hear her smile through the phone. "You always promise Daddy." "Yeah?" Randy said softly, watching the emergency lights paint the darkness in red and blue. "I do." Behind him, 187 people were stepping off a crippled aircraft, returning to lives they had almost lost. Reporters were already calling it a miracle. Investigators would spend months analyzing every decision, every adjustment, every second of the impossible landing. But none of that mattered to Randy. What mattered was the voice on the other end of the phone. What mattered was the promise he had kept. And maybe, just maybe, after 6 years of carrying the weight of one terrible night, he could finally begin to forgive himself.